Hi there. Good afternoon, everybody. I see we have about 13 attendees on the line. We might just give it another quick second, but thank you for making the time to be with us here virtually this afternoon. My name is Ryan Luby. I'm the Deputy Director of Communications for the City of Aurora. As you saw in our news release earlier this afternoon, we are announcing the selection of Dan Oates as interim police chief. We're doing this virtually because Mr. Oates is currently out of state, so this is the best we can do on the fly. For the reporters who are joining us on this call right now, as I mentioned to you via email, please type any questions you may have into the WebEx chat, and we will open up your mic and call on you in the order that your questions are received. Or you can raise your hand, the little hand icon at the bottom of your screen. Aurora City Manager Jim Twombly is also with us here. Jim will begin with some opening thoughts, then he'll toss it over to Dan, and then we'll open it up for questions. We want to keep this to about 30 minutes total, but for now, Jim, I will turn it over to you and take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. And I want to thank all those that are joining us today. This is an important discussion we're going to have and question and answer session. Let me first explain why Dan Oates. And I'll start off by just giving a little summary of his experience, beginning with his New York City experience was in multiple roles in the New York City Police Department. Following that, he went to Ann Arbor, Michigan as chief, and later during that time was made Safety Services Administrator, which encompassed not only the police department, but also fire, 911, and other municipal safety services. He left Ann Arbor to come to Aurora as police chief, named police chief in 2005, and served for almost 9 years here. And most Aurorans will recall, of course, his role in the aftermath of the tragic theater shooting in Aurora in 2012. And he's won many accolades for the police response to that tragic situation. Following his tenure in Aurora in 2014, Dan went to Miami Beach as police chief, where after his retirement in 2019, he took on consulting roles, helping municipal police departments in improving in many different ways. Uh, so, Interim Chief Oates has a longstanding uh, reputation both within our community because of his time here and the department itself. He's also a recognized leader in public safety policy and best practices. I would also say that Dan, while he was here, had a very good relationship with the community. In fact, I've had community members reach out to me between the time the press release went out and right now who have reached out, as I said, to me, welcoming Dan back to the community for his good work here. And have also reached out to other members of the community who have confirmed that they had a good working relationship with Dan. So we're pleased to hear that. I want to also mention that in my discussion with Dan leading up to his appointment, I've talked about my three priorities for him during his what will be perhaps a 6 to 8 month time period leading the department. Of course, I think everyone knows that we are operating under a consent decree, and there will be no lag or lapse in terms of implementation of that consent decree. Um, Dan understands what consent decrees are and is anxious to get started on that implementation. We also have a public safety partnership program going with the Department of Justice, and Dan is very familiar with those also and is very supportive of continuing our work in that arena. Second priority was um, the I think showing the support for our good officers who are out there right now protecting the community, and then also stabilizing the department. There has been, with the uncertainty with former Chief Wilson and uncertainty who would be coming in as interim, it's important for Dan to support and stabilize the department as we go forward. And then finally, as we all know, there's been more than an uptick in crime. And while this is a nationwide issue, we need to know, and our residents and businesses need to know, what is the city of Aurora going to do to address the crime issue. And so those three things, like I said, are my priorities, and I think Dan shares those also. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dan to uh, talk a little more about himself and what he would like to accomplish here in this time as interim chief.
Well, Jim, thank you for that generous introduction. And as I said in my statement, I'm honored and flattered to be coming back to help out Aurora in this challenging time. Aurora has a very special place in my life and the life of my family. We raised our two children during those formative 9 years, from when they were in middle school through high school. Um, my wife and I love Aurora. In fact, my wife said to me when I got the phone call asking if I'd consider coming back, she said, how can we say no? We got so much out of Aurora. It's an interim stint. We can manage this within our lives and do 6 months to help the city get through this challenging time. Obviously, my goals in running the department align with Jim's. We talked about my management style. And I'm very comfortable that Jim and I are on the same page about what needs to be done with the department right now. And obviously, the priority around the community. I like to think that in all the places in which I've worked as a chief, I did a good job of placing transparency, communication, trust building with the community at the top of the agenda. And I intend to do that in my time as interim. I'm absolutely committed to the reforms in the consent decree. I shared with Jim that the the leading contenders for the consent decree contract with the city, both those outfits reached out to me during the process to find out what I had to share with them about Aurora. I know folks on both the winning team and the team that competed against them. And I was invested. I've been invested in Aurora ever since I left. I read the Sentinel every day, and I track the major news items that come out of Aurora because I still love the city. So when Jim asked me to come back, I felt compelled to do what I can for 6 months. And it's also because I love the cops in the Aurora PD. Now, I probably no more than 50 or 60% of the people I worked with are still there. And there's a whole lot of new people I don't know. I look forward to meeting them, getting to know them. But I know deep down that there's a lot of talent and dedication in that organization, and that folks there are committed to serving the citizens of Aurora to the best of their ability. So I look forward to doing the best I can and helping the city through this interim period. And I also want to help Jim and the recruitment team to recruit the best possible talent. And I know folks in the business, and I intend to do what I can to help Jim and the team in that regard. So, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Jim. I think Colleen Slevin from the Associated Press had her hand raised first. Colleen, do you want to go ahead? You're on mute if you're talking.
Hi, this is Colleen. Unmuted, I think now. Chief Oates, you've spoken before about the challenge of disciplining officers because of unions and civil service protections. I'm just wondering, I know you're just coming for a short time. Is that something that you want to tackle during the interim time as chief, disciplining officers?
Well, I guess you're referring to an article I wrote, an op-ed piece I wrote in the Washington Post a while ago. And that was in the context of the broader conversation after the George Floyd incident about holding cops accountable. Every city is different. I've worked in 4 different major cities in this country. I've been a chief in 3. And in all of those cities, my point in that article was the democratic process has determined what the disciplinary process is. And my point was, if in individual cities, if folks are unhappy with that, the democratic process is the way to change that. Now, I'm very familiar with discipline and how it worked in Aurora 8 years ago. I imagine there are some nuanced changes since I left in 2014 and I'm going to have to learn about them. Obviously, the very best solution would be that there is no need for discipline during the 6 months that I am there. But if there is, I'm about as experienced as any police chief, having served in 18 years as a chief in 3 cities, on how to manage discipline within the rules. So we'll just have to see. To the extent my bosses, Jim and Jason and anyone else, want my input on potential changes to how discipline is done in Aurora, I will freely give it, especially with my experience elsewhere. So, no, I'm not coming in with an agenda to change the discipline process. Like everything else about my arrival in Aurora, the first thing I have to do is level set, get my feet on the ground and understand what the current climate is, because I've been gone for 8 years, and what the rules are around any particular issue, whether it's hiring, whether it's how the consent decree is going to be implemented, whether it's discipline, and also whether it's crime fighting and crime reduction. I've got to get up to speed. I know a lot about the city, and I know a lot about the cops and the capabilities of the cops in the department, and the interactions with the other department heads, and mustering resources and working with our federal partners. But it's also true that I've been gone for 8 years, so I've got a lot to learn.
Thanks, Dan. I think our next question comes from Matt Jablow at 9 News. Matt, go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Great. Chief, welcome back to Colorado, at least virtually. You might not remember, but you and I met in Baltimore several years ago when I was the chief of communications at BPD.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. I think we met in my office, in fact, before I saw the light and came back to journalism. And I now cover crime and justice for Channel 9 here in Denver, which I did 20 years ago. I'd like to ask you a question about the consent decree, because I think most of us would agree there's nothing much more important, perhaps except crime reduction, than implementing the consent decree. I saw during my time at Baltimore, during which we were under a federal consent decree, that there was nothing more important in terms of successfully implementing the consent decree than winning over the cops, convincing them that it was the right thing to do, especially the veteran cops. I had more than one longtime police officer, good cops as far as I could tell, who said to me, I just can't police like this. How are you going to win? I know you're only going to be here for 6 months, but arguably these 6 months are crucial, the first 6 months, in terms of setting the tone for the implementation of the consent decree. How are you going to win over the cops, convincing them that it's the right thing to do to make these major reforms, especially the veteran cops?
Well, a couple of thoughts. First off, I've read the consent decree, and it's a pretty darn good document. Okay, it is a good roadmap. It's nowhere near as constraining or onerous as some of the ones I've seen coming out of the federal courts. There's a lot of good stuff in there to work with. Part of my job and the job of the command staff is to convey that message to the cops, and we can do that. Another thing I intend to do in my meetings, my individual meetings with the command staff. I just got off the phone with Chris Jewell right before this conference, and I told Chris that very early on, in fact, probably before I arrive, I'm going to start 1 hour, 90-minute one-on-one conversations with each of the command staff, and I'm going to ask them exactly that same question. How did we get, in the 8 years since I left, to the place where we are today? What do you think could be done differently? What can we do to get the officers in the department and the civilian employees in the department to buy into the consent decree? Because it is the only way out of, to the extent that they feel that the image of the department is tarnished, their image is personally tarnished, the only way out of that is the roadmap of the consent decree. So the question for the command staff that's been there since I've been gone is, how are we going to do that? What good ideas do you have? And there has to be an effort by leadership every single day to convince the employees of the department that this is the roadmap. And by the way, there are plenty of police departments in the country that have been through this process very, very successfully. One of my mentors is Bill Bratton. And when Bill was the chief in LA, he had to manage through a consent decree, which they've now come out of. And it's a better department for it. So it is the only way to move forward for the department. And yeah, it's our job to get the officers to embrace it, and we intend to do that.
So just quickly a follow-up. You obviously know cops a lot better than I do. You would agree that it will be a challenge to convince some.
It's a challenge to convince some cops of anything. Okay, when you have a workforce of 800 employees, there's always a handful that it's a challenge to convince of anything that's a good idea. So yes, it'll be a challenge to convince some, but I think it's actually a pretty easy argument that this is the roadmap to improving the image of the department, which, cops may or may not acknowledge it, is terribly, terribly important to them. That they want to feel good about the agency they work with, proud of the agency they work with, and the work that they do. Yes, it's a high priority to do. And part of the success and achieving the manager's goals is achieving that buy-in from the officers. So yes, it'll be among the highest priorities for me and my command staff while I'm there.
Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Matt. I think we have Max Levy next from the Sentinel. Max, go ahead.
All right, can you all hear me okay?
We sure can.
Great. So back in 2013, Steve Hogan proposed more oversight and transparency in the police department, asking the city to create an independent monitorship similar to what the city is embarking on right now. And at the time, you said you thought that that was an intrusion on your powers as chief. Have you changed your mind about an independent monitor in the police department?
I think, Max, I don't recall exactly what I may have said, but my point, I think, at the time was I'm all in favor of whatever the democratic process wants to create by way of independent monitorship, as long as it doesn't intrude on the chief's authority to decide how the organization operates, or the chief's authority in the current structure of the PD on discipline. It's a somewhat nuanced answer to your question, but I believe that that's the position I took at the time. If the elected leaders and the voters of any given municipality, including Aurora, think that some sort of monitorship is appropriate, some sort of structure, a civilian review board, et cetera, then the role of the police chief is to support the decision of the democratic process. But my concern during those discussions was about taking away from the chief in that current structure of Aurora at the time, the chief's authority to decide discipline. I think that that's, truly important. The way I think an ideal police department should operate is that the chief decides what's appropriate discipline in a transparent way for the cops and for the community. And if the community and the elected officials are unhappy with those decisions, then you get rid of the chief. But to substitute the judgment of the chief around discipline, this was the point I was making at the time, for some body of civilians, I think was a path that the Aurora should not go down. And I seem to recall that was the point that I was making at the time.
And Ryan, if I could
Please,
make
Jim. Yes.
clarification on that, I think what Max was talking about and what Dan was talking about is different from the independent consent decree monitor, which is a monitor that is set up to look at the consent decree and make sure that the department adopts what the consent decree is recommending, what needs to be implemented, which is different from an independent monitor that may have purview over many other things within the department.
Right, and that's exactly right. And the structure that Aurora has set up with an independent monitor to ensure that the consent decree is complied with is the national best practice and exactly the right decision that Aurora should have made. So thank you, Jim, for making that clarification.
And I had one more follow-up question, kind of dovetailing with the consent decree. I know improving the diversity of the police force in Aurora is one of the goals of the consent decree. And so I was just going to ask, what do you plan to do to make the police force more representative of the community of Aurora?
Well, I've had some conversations already with Jim and Jason, the city attorney's office, et cetera, about the current hiring structure. I was frustrated in my 8 years in Aurora with how hiring was done. And I think there's opportunity for more flexibility. It should be in this current climate. And by the way, I'm in Milwaukee with a group of folks from Baltimore, meeting with senior leadership in Milwaukee about some of their crime fighting strategies as part of my work with the DOJ. And what comes up in every single meeting is recruitment, retention. Nationally, it's a crisis. We have to find a way in Aurora that when the best candidate walks in the door and says, I want to be an Aurora police officer, the candidate that fits our profile for an ideal candidate, we have to find a way to process and hire that candidate as soon as possible. Not to tell them there's going to be a civil service test in 3 months, then it's going to take 2 months to process this and another month to process that. In this hiring climate, if you tell a candidate that, that candidate is going to get hired by another police department. So there has to be um, an adjustment to process to ensure that when the best possible candidates walk in the door, we find a way to process them quickly, because they are rarer and rarer to find. And you can define your best possible candidate in any way. The entire time I was in Aurora, we struggled around minority recruitment, and hitting our diversity marks. We had some success, but a lot of frustration and a lot of failure. So um, there has to be flexibility. I don't know how much flexibility there is now versus 8 years ago, but it will be a very high priority of mine to work with HR, work with the manager, work with the city attorney's office, and work with the Civil Service Commission to do what we can in that regard.
Thanks, Dan. We have two more people on the line here, and that may be about all the time we have. First is Kelly Reinke from Channel 9, and then Julia Cardi from the Gazette. Kelly, we'll start with you.
Hi there. Thanks so much for taking the time. Just a quick question. One of City Manager Jim Twombly's priorities for you is to address an uptick in crime in Aurora. What specific plans do you have in place right now to address that and reduce crime in the city?
I have ideas, but no plans. It would be foolish to be saying to you today what my plans are. I've been around enough, smart enough to know when you come into an organization from the outside, the first thing you have to do is find out exactly what's going on and how things are structured. Um, Jim and I talked about this a little. Even though I'm only an interim, when it comes to crime reduction and preventing victimization, my behavior is going to be as if I'm running the organization indefinitely. In other words, if I think there's a move that has to be made or a change in structure that has to take place, I am going to do that. But it's simply premature to ask me, are you going to do A or you're going to do B? I will tell you that everything starts with your data analysis, your understanding of when and where crime is occurring and who's behind it. I will tell you that when I left in 2014, we had a robust infrastructure around that. And the first thing I need to do is see what's in place when I get there. And again, that's another question I'm going to ask of the command staff, and I'm going to ask it of the cops, because as I make the rounds and go to roll calls and do ride-alongs and those kinds of things, some of the best ideas around crime fighting in a police agency come from the street level cops. So there's work to be done in that regard, but I don't have an immediate answer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Julia from the Gazette.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
We can.
So my question was also about the hiring process. So the former chief had said to me that she believed that the chief should have more involvement in the hiring of new officers rather than the process only being controlled by the Civil Service Commission. Do you believe that here in Aurora, should the chief have a say in which, who is hired as new officers in that process?
Well, the short answer is yes, but I need to get on the ground there and understand and work with the manager and HR and legal strategically on how we advocate within, the democratic process of Aurora to have more say. So the short answer is, of course, yes. And, I personally approved every hire in Miami Beach after carefully considering all the information from everyone involved. I had more flexibility in Miami Beach around that, and I appreciated having that discretion and flexibility.
I think we have time for one more. Jim, I'm
I
sorry.
could
Go
just,
ahead.
add to that a little bit, because the consent decree does address the hiring issue. And so part of their work here will be to work with the Civil Service Commission. And we certainly, because of Dan's experience, will appreciate his input in that also. So that is, like I say, part of the consent decree, something that needs to be looked at. And we expect that there will be positive changes coming out of that assessment.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Dan. We do have time for one more. Rogelio from 31. Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Mr. Ruby. Chief Oates, first and foremost, welcome back to Colorado. I guess unofficially, but virtually at least. We've talked about your plans for the department. Briefly, if you wouldn't mind, any plans or ambitions? You're going to be here at least until the end of the year, at least according to city leaders there. Any plans to engage with the community, or how you might do that?
Well, those who know me from the community and from my time there knows that that was top of my priority when I was there last time. So I've already been on the phone with a number of community leaders, some of whom know me, and so my definition of self is that that's what I need to do, and I think I have a pretty good track record in all three cities in which I was a police chief. So absolutely, engagement with the community is essential, but it's not just about me. It's about my command staff and my frontline officers. Again, I go back to 14 when I left. I thought we had a pretty good capacity and ability and willingness to engage with the community. And I hope to find that when I get back. And if not, I'll use my skills and advocacy to make sure that the entire department is appropriately engaged.
Thanks, Dan. Jim, any final thoughts before we go? Dan, any final thoughts?
Well, I would just say that we're really happy that Dan has accepted this this challenge. We're looking forward to having him here and begin this journey, short though it may be. Like I said, he's nationally recognized for the things that he's done in the various chief capacity, and also since he's been consulting and so on. So we're real pleased to have him and look forward to the work that he'll do here.
And Jim, thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to getting back to Aurora as soon as I possibly can, and hopefully no later than the end of May. So I'll get there as soon as I can.
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everyone, for hopping on this virtual meeting. Hopefully we'll do this in person next time. That's all we have. We'll keep you posted. Thanks for joining us, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.